There is a paradox that leaves many empaths confused for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. The person who makes you feel the most loved, the most seen, the most intensely desired, is often the very person who quietly wounds you the deepest. They speak words of affection, yet their eyes carry an unease that is hard to name. They keep you very close, while at the same time constantly diminishing you, controlling you, making you doubt yourself. And the most bewildering part is this: they do not leave you, they cling to you, as if they cannot live without you, yet they also cannot tolerate your full presence. If you have ever felt that something is very wrong in a relationship like this, you are not imagining it. You are standing in front of an unconscious dynamic that psychoanalysis described more than a century ago. Through the lens of Sigmund Freud, love is never a purely clean, noble, or fully conscious movement. Love always carries libido, life energy, bonding energy, and when that libido is bound to a fragile ego, it does not create love, but possession. A narcissist does not love an empath in the sense of connecting two independent subjects. They attach the empath to their psychological system as a regulating mechanism, a living mirror, a source of ego stability. And it is precisely here that the seed of envy is formed, not from hatred, but from an unavoidable unconscious comparison. An empath carries a very particular kind of energy, the capacity to feel, to love, to be present, and to connect without needing to control another person in order to exist. For someone with a healthy ego structure, this is beauty. But for a narcissist, it is a threat. Because every time an empath loves naturally, they inadvertently expose what the narcissist cannot face: their own inner incapacity to love without manipulation. And in that very moment, false love begins to fracture, giving way to something deeper, darker, and more dangerous: narcissistic envy. What wounds the empath is not that the narcissist does not love them, but that the narcissist both needs them and resents them. They need the empath to maintain a sense of self-worth, yet they envy the empath for possessing an inner freedom the narcissist cannot access. This is a form of envy that is never acknowledged, because to acknowledge it would cause the narcissist's ego to collapse. Instead, that envy is pushed into the unconscious and returns in subtler forms: control, devaluation, gaslighting, emotional punishment, or sudden coldness immediately following moments of intimacy. Empaths often do not recognize this early on because they read relationships in the language of the heart, while narcissists operate by the logic of a wounded ego. Empaths believe love can heal, that understanding can soothe the dark corners. But Freud pointed to a colder truth. Not every wound wants to be healed. There are egos that survive by avoiding healing, and anyone who reflects the possibility of living differently becomes an invisible enemy. This video is not about narcissists being bad or empaths being good. It is about a deep psychological mechanism in which false love and unconscious envy coexist within an unequal structure. When you understand why empaths trigger envy in narcissists, especially those who pretend to love you, stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" and begin to see a more important truth. Some people do not resent you because you are weak, but because you carry something they will never have. Part 1. Freud. Envy is not jealousy but a narcissistic wound. To understand why an empath triggers such deep envy in a narcissist, we must first dismantle a common misunderstanding. Envy in this dynamic is not the same as ordinary jealousy. It is not the feeling of, "I want what you have." Through the lens of Sigmund Freud, narcissistic envy is a defensive reaction of an ego that is threatened at its very roots. It is not directed outward, but erupts from within, where the narcissist's ego was never formed in a stable way. According to Freud, the narcissistic structure is not built on a sense of "I am enough," but on a fragile illusion of self-worth. The narcissist survives by constantly maintaining an image of being special, superior, and worthy of admiration. But this image has no internal foundation. It requires mirrors. It requires validation from others. And most importantly, it cannot tolerate unconscious comparison with a self that is capable of self-love, self-feeling, and self-existence without performance. The empath becomes the trigger for that comparison without any intention to do so. Not because the empath boasts, not because they are better, but because they live differently. The empath can bond without losing themselves, can love without needing control, can feel pain without collapsing. For a healthy ego, this is ordinary. But for a narcissist, it is like a spotlight shining directly into an inner void, the place where they never learned how to tolerate real emotions without hiding behind a persona. Freud called this the narcissistic wound, a primitive injury. This wound is not formed by present-day failures, but very early on, when a fragile ego was not mirrored correctly, not loved for its real humanity, but only loved when it performed or met conditions. The result is an ego that grows up in fear of disintegration. And when confronted with an empath, someone who can remain present in emotion without falling apart, the narcissist does not feel inspired. They feel unconsciously insulted. This is where envy is born. But not envy because the empath is more successful, more attractive, or stronger. It is envy because the empath does not need to perform in order to exist. The empath becomes living proof of a psychological capacity the narcissist does not possess, the ability to love without possessing another person's self. And this is especially dangerous, because it shatters the inner narrative the narcissist has relied on to survive. I must control to feel safe. I must be at the center to exist. Narcissistic envy, therefore, never becomes conscious. The narcissist rarely thinks, I envy your capacity to love. Instead, the feeling is pushed into the unconscious and returns in distorted forms. Inexplicable irritation, subtle criticism, a sense of threat when the empath shines quietly and naturally. They do not want the empath to disappear because they need them as an emotional regulator, but they also cannot tolerate the empath existing as who they truly are. At the deepest level, Freud suggested that the narcissist does not envy the empath because the empath is above them, but because the empath reminds them of the most painful truth, a self they were never allowed to become. And when that unconscious memory is activated, love is no longer love. It becomes mixed with resentment, hostility, and destructive impulses, all rooted in a wound they do not feel safe enough to face. Part 2. Why the narcissist's love always turns into envy. When an empath enters a narcissist's life, the first thing that happens is not conflict, but intense attraction. Narcissists are often drawn to empaths quickly, deeply, and extremely. From Freud's perspective, this is not love in a mature sense, but a narcissistic investment of libido. The narcissist does not direct libido outward to meet an independent person. Instead, they attach it to the empath as an extension of their ego. At this stage, the empath is idealized not for who they are, but for the function they serve, soothing anxiety, supporting the ego, and confirming the narcissist's value. The problem begins when the empath does more than fulfill that function, when they unintentionally reveal a dangerous truth. They love without losing themselves. The empath does not dissolve into the narcissist, does not disappear into people-pleasing, does not need control to maintain connection. This emotional autonomy begins to crack the narcissist's structure of love, because for them, love has always meant possession. Without possession, they feel unsafe. And when the person in front of them can love while remaining free, an unconscious and deeply threatening question arises. Then what am I doing? According to Freud, the narcissist's libido is not released properly to form a reciprocal bond. It turns back toward the ego. As a result, narcissistic love does not seek encounter, it seeks ego reinforcement. The empath, simply by loving naturally, disrupts that logic. Every time the empath sets a boundary, keeps their emotions for themselves, or refuses to react according to a control script, the narcissist does not feel less loved. They feel existentially threatened. At this point, love transforms into envy. Not because the narcissist no longer needs the empath, but because they need the empath in the old way, while the empath cannot, and should not, remain in that role forever. The empath becomes living evidence that the narcissist's dependency is not love, but an emotional survival mechanism. And nothing injures a narcissistic structure more deeply than being forced to see this truth. This envy does not explode immediately, it seeps in. The narcissist becomes irritated by the empath's calm, by their ability to exist fully without needing them. They may say, "I love you," but internally another impulse emerges. "If I cannot fully possess you, I must make you smaller." This is when false love begins to merge with devaluation, subtle control, or suffocating care. Unquote. Unquote. Freud emphasized that wherever libido cannot flow outward freely to form mature relationships, it turns inward and becomes destructive toward the very object it clings to. The empath becomes the target not because they are wrong, but because they cannot and will not serve as a container for an undeveloped ego. The narcissist's love, therefore, always carries the seed of envy, loving out of need, resenting because they are exposed, and attacking because they cannot tolerate the freedom the empath represents. Part 3. The unconscious competition. When the empath becomes a rival they dare not name. One of the most dangerous misunderstandings empaths carry is the belief, "We are not competing. I am not fighting them." And that is true on the conscious level. The empath never enters a contest. But on the unconscious level, the narcissist does. From the perspective of Sigmund Freud, the deepest human conflicts do not occur between two individuals, but between incompatible ego structures. The empath activates a competition the narcissist cannot win, because it is a competition over ways of being. The narcissist does not compete through actions or concrete achievements. They compete through inner value. And the empath, simply through natural presence, unintentionally becomes a dangerous opponent. Not because the empath wants to win, but because they carry something the narcissist cannot replicate: inner coherence. The empath can feel sadness without blaming, love without manipulating, endure pain without destroying others to escape it. For the narcissist, these qualities do not inspire, they generate unconscious humiliation. According to Freud, when the ego is not strong enough to contain real emotion, it activates projection. The narcissist cannot admit, "I feel inferior to your way of living." Instead, that feeling is pushed onto the empath. "You think you're better than me. You make me feel worthless. You're acting superior." The truth is that the empath does nothing at all. The empath's emotional stability forces the narcissist to confront their own emptiness. And that is unbearable. This unconscious competition compels the narcissist to restore a sense of power. And because they cannot develop internally to meet the empath on equal ground, they choose the familiar path: devaluation. Diminishing the empath is not about winning, it is about reducing pain. If the empath becomes smaller, the light becomes less blinding. If the empath begins to doubt themselves, the comparison temporarily stops. This is why narcissists often attack the very qualities that once made them love the empath. Sensitivity is labeled weakness, compassion is dismissed as naivete, independence is twisted into coldness or selfishness. What is particularly cruel at this stage is that the narcissist still needs the empath. They do not want the empath to disappear from their life, because the empath remains a vital source of emotional regulation. Yet they cannot allow the empath to stand as an inner equal. The result is a tearing tension, pulling the empath close while quietly dismantling them. This is not a logical contradiction, it is a structural contradiction of an ego that survives through others while resenting its own dependency. Freud noted that when an ego is forced to face an ideal image it cannot attain, destructive impulses emerge. The empath becomes the embodiment of a possible self the narcissist was never allowed to develop. And because they cannot kill that memory within themselves, they attempt to blur it externally. The unconscious competition is therefore never spoken, but constantly acted out in every cutting remark, every withdrawal of affection. Every moment the empath is made to feel too much, wrong, or in need of change. And if the empath does not realize they are being pulled into a competition they never agreed to enter, they will continue trying to prove themselves through love, while what the narcissist is truly fighting is not the empath, but the truth about themselves. Part 4. Why they have to pretend to love you. A question empaths often carry for a very long time, sometimes even after the relationship has ended, is, if they envy me this much, why don't they leave? Why do they keep saying they love me? The answer is not found in morality, nor in surface emotions. It lies in the narcissistic psychological structure. From Freud's perspective, the narcissist cannot fully hate the empath because they depend on the empath at a level far deeper than their own awareness. The narcissist needs the empath not as a partner, but as an ego-stabilizing mechanism. The empath occupies what Freud described as a libidinal investment object, a place where life, energy, emotion, validation, and even unprocessed chaos are deposited, things the narcissist cannot regulate alone. When the empath is present, the narcissist feels real, valuable, mirrored. For this reason, they cannot openly hate the empath. Doing so would mean cutting off a vital source of emotional regulation. But the problem is this: the empath does not only soothe, they illuminate. And that light exposes the envy, the incompleteness, and the dependency the narcissist cannot accept. The result is a psychological state Freud called ambivalence, love, and hatred coexisting within the same object. The narcissist both needs the empath to survive and resents the empath for revealing their lack. And to hold this contradiction without collapsing, they are forced to pretend to love. This pretense is not always conscious. Many narcissists genuinely believe they love the empath, because in their inner world, needing and loving are the same. They call it love because it is the closest thing to love they have ever experienced. But that love always carries an unspoken condition. The empath must continue to mirror, continue to yield space, continue not to be too free. When the empath deviates from that role even slightly, the love immediately changes color. This is why empaths often experience a very distinctive pattern: moments of deep tenderness alternating with inexplicable coldness, cruelty, or devaluation. Not because the narcissist's emotions are randomly unstable, but because two opposing drives coexist. One is the need for attachment to survive psychologically, the other is envy and hatred toward the light the empath carries. When one intensifies, the other temporarily recedes, only to return again. Freud pointed out that in ambivalence, love is no longer a meeting between two subjects, but an unconscious battlefield. The empath is kept not because they are cherished, but because they are too important to lose, while at the same time too dangerous to be allowed to be fully themselves. Pretending to love, therefore, is not always a calculated strategy, but the only way the narcissist can maintain their fragile inner balance. For the empath, this creates a profoundly confusing experience. If they don't love me, why do they suffer when they lose me? If they do love me, why am I always hurt? The answer is this: you are inside a structure where love is not used to connect, but to control another person's internal collapse. And as long as the empath believes that tenderness is proof of real love, they remain trapped in a role the narcissist both needs, envies, and will never truly be able to value. Part 5. When envy turns into quiet sabotage. Narcissistic envy does not stop at emotion. It has to be acted out to release pressure inside a wounded ego. And because the narcissist cannot admit their envy directly, it slips into subtle, hard-to-pin-down forms of sabotage, quiet, sophisticated, yet devastating over time. Through the lens of Sigmund Freud, when libido is trapped inside the ego and cannot transform into mature attachment, it turns against the very object it depends on. The turning point usually arrives silently, not through a dramatic betrayal, not through an explosive argument, but through small cuts repeated again and again. A doubt planted precisely when the empath is confident, a cold glance when the empath is shining, a punishing silence right after intimacy. The narcissist does not want the empath to disappear. They only want the empath to be less themselves. Because every time the empath stands firmly in inner value, envy is triggered and the ego hurts. Freud described this as a sadistic impulse of the wounded ego, hurting someone else to hurt less oneself. When the narcissist devalues the empath, they do not feel stronger in any healthy sense. They simply feel less threatened. Sabotage, therefore, often targets the empath's core strengths. Intuition is labeled too sensitive. Compassion is dismissed as naive. Boundaries are twisted into selfishness, and calmness is interpreted as coldness. A crucial point to understand is this: the narcissist sabotages not because they hate the empath, but because they cannot tolerate unconscious inferiority. They cannot raise themselves through inner growth, so they pull the empath down to restore balance. This is why empaths often feel themselves becoming smaller in the relationship, not because they are weakening, but because the system around them is constantly draining life energy, eroding confidence, and planting doubt in their own perceptions. Sabotage also rarely happens openly. The narcissist must preserve the image of being loving, sacrificial, the one who only wants what's best for you. So, envy disguises itself as care, constant feedback, reshaping the empath, asking questions that force the empath to justify their feelings. Freud would frame this as the ego protecting itself through rationalization, turning destructive impulses into something that appears reasonable, logical, for your own good. The most dangerous part is that empaths often respond by trying to love more, understand more, endure more. But that endurance unintentionally prolongs the loop. Because every time the empath tolerates harm without setting a boundary, the narcissist learns one thing: envy can be discharged without a cost. And when there are no consequences, the sabotage escalates, not because the narcissist becomes more evil, but because their psychological structure only knows how to regulate itself by hurting someone else. Freud emphasized that wherever love is ruled by unconscious envy, the relationship stops being a space of healing and becomes a stage for immature impulses. For the empath, recognizing this is a life or death turning point, because once you understand that the wounds you carry are not the price of love, but the result of envy that cannot be acknowledged, you stop trying to fix yourself and you begin asking the right question. Am I being loved, or am I being used to reduce the pain of an ego that refuses to grow? Part 6. Why empaths don't see it early. When empathy becomes a trap, a painful but unavoidable question is this: if envy and sabotage were present from early on, why do empaths often realize it so late? The answer is not naivete or weakness. It lies in the empath's empathic structure and how that structure is exploited inside narcissistic dynamics. From Freud's view, people bond not only through consciousness, but through unconscious scripts formed very early in life. Empaths tend to read the world through an inner language. Emotions have causes, pain can be healed, and harmful behavior often comes from deeper pain. This is a noble quality in mature relationships. But inside narcissistic structures, that same quality becomes a vulnerability. The empath does not see envy, they see a wound. And when they see a wound, their natural reflex is not to leave, but to stay. Freud noted that when someone has a tendency to carry emotions for others, they can slip into the role of an unconscious repair object. The empath begins interpreting the narcissist's harmful behaviors as, they're afraid of abandonment. They were hurt. If I'm patient enough, they'll change. The truth is, the empath is using their own value system to decode a completely different psychological structure. And in that structure, empathy is not understood as connection, it is treated as a resource. Another reason empaths don't see it early is the alternation between tenderness and harm. Narcissists do not sabotage constantly, they sabotage rhythmically. After hurting the empath, there is often a compensatory moment, a vague apology, sudden intimacy, or intense reassurance. Freud described this as a form of inverted reinforcement, where the brain binds positive emotion to the very source of pain. The empath does not only love the person, they begin to love the hope that the person can become a better version of themselves. Empaths also tend to question themselves before questioning others. When something feels wrong, they don't think, this is envy. They think, am I too sensitive? Am I asking for too much? Self-reflection is normally a strength, but inside narcissistic dynamics, it is flipped into self-doubt. And every time the empath doubts their own intuition, the narcissist becomes safer in continuing sabotage. Freud emphasized that not every relationship can be healed by love, because not every ego wants to mature. Empaths often realize late because they believe pain is a phase, not a structure. They wait for change in a place where change would equal the collapse of the other person's ego. And of course, that does not happen. The empath's awakening does not come from one single cruel act, but from quiet accumulation, the moment they realize they are constantly shrinking, explaining, yielding, and self-editing to keep the peace. Then a new question emerges, no longer, how do I get them to love me correctly? But, why do I have to disappear in order to be loved? And that question becomes the exit from the trap that misplaced empathy unintentionally built. The end of this journey is not about the empath understanding more about the narcissist. It is about the moment the empath stops explaining themselves. Because the deepest truth psychoanalysis points to is not what the narcissist did to you, but the role you were pulled into inside their unconscious structure. Through Freud's lens, narcissistic envy is not aimed at the empath's weakness. It targets the empath's capacity to live, love, and remain present without manipulation, something the narcissist cannot develop without collapsing their own ego. As long as the empath believes love can heal every wound, they will stay, endure, and keep shrinking to preserve harmony. But when the empath understands that not every wound wants to be healed and not every "I love you" has the capacity to hold real love, a quiet transformation begins. The empath stops treating envy as their problem. They stop proving their worth, stop reshaping themselves to be less threatening, stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" The truth is, the empath does not trigger envy because they are too much, but because they are enough. Enough presence, enough depth, enough inner freedom to exist without controlling anyone. And inside a narcissistic structure, that wholeness becomes unbearable. The narcissist does not resent the empath because the empath is weak. They envy the empath because the empath carries something they cannot possess, copy, or fully destroy. When the empath withdraws from the role of unconscious healer, what happens is not revenge and not a loud victory. It is sovereign silence. It is stopping participation in a competition you never signed up for. It is choosing truth over misplaced hope. And here, power shifts not because the narcissist collapses, but because the empath is no longer standing within their radius of influence. The final message is not pain, but clarity. There are people who cannot love you without simultaneously envying you. And the healthiest thing you can do is not to love them harder, but to stop letting your light be treated as a threat. Because you were not born to be a patchwork mirror for an ego that refuses to grow. You were born to live fully, even if that makes those who only know how to exist through control turn away in silence.